My name is Haley and I'm 28. The gavel came down like a gunshot, and 23 people in that courtroom erupted in laughter. At me. The judge himself was wiping tears from his eyes as he declared me clearly unfit to manage millions. My own parents sat there smirking like they'd just won the lottery, which in their minds, they had. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me back up to explain how I ended up being the punchline in my own inheritance hearing. It all started when I was 7 years old, standing in my childhood bedroom while my parents packed my little suitcase. "Grandpa William wants you to stay with him for a while," Mom said, not meeting my eyes, "just until we figure some things out." That while lasted 21 years. And honestly, best thing that ever happened to me. My parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, weren't evil. They were just convenient people. They loved the idea of having money, but not the responsibility that came with it. When I was born, Grandpa William was already disappointed in his son. Dad had this talent for big ideas and zero follow-through. Mom was beautiful, charming, and completely allergic to anything resembling hard work. Grandpa saw what was happening. I'd show up to family dinners with bruises on my shins from running into furniture that hadn't been moved out of walkways. My clothes never quite fit right because nobody paid attention to when I outgrew things. I wasn't abused, just forgotten, like a houseplant that occasionally got watered. "How would you like to have your own room at Grandpa's house?" he asked me one afternoon. I was 8 then, old enough to recognize rescue when I saw it. "With books and a big window? Can I bring my teddy bear?" Absolutely. That conversation changed everything. Within months, I was legally living with Grandpa William. My parents visited on holidays and birthdays, played the doting parent act for photos, then disappeared back to their social lives. They got to look good without doing any actual parenting. Classic Morrison efficiency. Grandpa William was everything they weren't. Consistent, present, interested in my thoughts and dreams. He taught me chess, helped with homework, and never once made me feel like an inconvenience. When I showed interest in debate team, he drove me to every tournament. When I decided I wanted to study law, he smiled and said, "Now that sounds like a Morrison with some sense." The day I got into Harvard, I called my parents to share the news. Dad's first question? "How much is this going to cost your grandfather?" Because of course it was. Living with Grandpa William was like having your own personal cheerleader who happened to be worth $30 million. Not that he flaunted it. The man drove a 15-year-old Honda and mended his own socks. "Money is a tool, Haley," he'd say. "The minute it becomes your identity, you've lost yourself." My parents never learned that lesson. They lived in a nice house that Grandpa William bought them, drove cars he financed, and attended charity galas on his dime. They were professional grandchildren, basically, and they were really good at it. "Your father has such vision," Grandpa would tell me with this look in his eyes that said he was trying to convince himself. "He just needs to find the right opportunity." Right. 47 years old and still looking for his big break. Meanwhile, Mom hosted book clubs for wealthy ladies and called it intellectual development. The books never had more than 200 pages. But here's what my parents didn't realize while they were playing house with Grandpa's money. He was watching. Always watching. He saw how they never asked about my grades, how they forgot my birthday 3 years running, how they'd show up to family functions with expensive gifts for each other and some hastily grabbed drugstore present for me. "Do they ever call to check on you?" Grandpa asked when I was 14. "Mom texted last week," I lied. "About what?" "Just stuff." He knew I was lying. I knew he knew. But Grandpa William was too classy to push it. Instead, he just made sure I never felt the absence. Piano lessons, summer camps, college prep tutoring. He showed up to parent-teacher conferences and took notes like my future actually mattered to him, because it did. When I started at Harvard, Grandpa insisted on driving me there himself. "First Morrison to attend an Ivy League school," he said, hands gripping the steering wheel. "Your parents couldn't make it? Dad has a business meeting. Mom has her book club. On move-in day?" I shrugged like it didn't matter. "They're busy people. We're all busy, sweetheart. It's about priorities." That ride to Cambridge was when he first mentioned the will. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," he said casually. "What really matters when you're gone? Grandpa, you're not going anywhere for decades. Perhaps. But when I do, I want to make sure I leave things in the right hands. Responsible hands." I thought he meant Dad. Shows what I knew. At Harvard, I threw myself into studying constitutional law, corporate litigation, international finance. Grandpa visited every semester, sitting in the back of my moot court competitions with this proud smile that made all the late-night study sessions worth it. My parents? They came to graduation, Showed up 15 minutes late, left during the reception. Mom complained the whole time about the uncomfortable chairs and the length of the ceremony. Dad spent most of it on his phone, probably planning his next big investment opportunity. Harvard Law, Grandpa said that night at dinner. Top 10% of your class. I couldn't be prouder. My parents nodded politely. Like I'd announced, I'd learned to make toast. That should have been my first clue about what was coming. Grandpa William died on a Tuesday in March, quietly in his sleep. No drama, no last-minute scrambling for bedside conversations. Just peaceful, which somehow made it worse. I was 26, 2 years out of Harvard, working at a small firm in Boston. The call came from his housekeeper at 6:30 in the morning. Miss Haley, I think you should come home. I drove the 4 hours to his house in Connecticut in a daze. My parents were already there, moving through his study with this focused efficiency that made my stomach turn. They weren't grieving, they were inventory taking. Oh, sweetheart, Mom said, wrapping me in a perfunctory hug. We're all going to miss him terribly. What are you doing? I asked, watching Dad examine papers on Grandpa's desk. Just organizing, he said without looking up. These things need to be handled properly. The funeral was beautiful. Grandpa would have hated it. Too much pomp, too much expense. Mom insisted on the mahogany casket, the imported flowers, the cathedral instead of the simple church service he'd wanted. He deserves the best, she kept saying. With whose money, I wondered, but kept quiet. Grief makes you diplomatic. After the service, people kept approaching me with stories about Grandpa's generosity, how he'd quietly paid for someone's medical bills, or funded scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college. I'd lived with the man for 21 years and barely knew half of it. He'd been helping people his entire adult life, and never mentioned it once. He thought you hung the moon, Mrs. Henderson from next door told me, always talking about his brilliant granddaughter who was going to change the world. Meanwhile, my parents were 3 tables over, accepting condolences like they'd lost their dearest friend, instead of the man who'd been bankrolling their entire lifestyle. The will reading was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Standard procedure, the lawyer explained, nothing to worry about. But I noticed my parents spending those days in hushed conversations that stopped whenever I walked into the room. Are you worried about something? I asked Dad that Sunday. Worried? No, just, there's a lot to sort out when someone passes. Business interests, properties, it's complicated. I could help, I do know something about legal matters. That's sweet, honey, but this is family business. Family business. As if I weren't family. As if 21 years of being more daughter than granddaughter counted for nothing. Tuesday night, I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. My parents were being different, too careful with their words, too interested in my schedule. When I mentioned maybe taking a few weeks off work to help settle Grandpa's affairs, Dad practically jumped out of his chair. No need for that, he said quickly. We can handle everything. I live here too. Lived here. This was my home for most of my life. Of course, sweetheart. But you have your own life now, your career. Grandpa wouldn't want you to put that on hold. Since when did my parents care about my career? Since when did they worry about my putting anything on hold? I'd been putting my life on hold for their convenience since childhood. That's when it hit me. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about me being involved in something they wanted to handle themselves. The will reading was at 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. I wore the navy dress Grandpa had bought me for my law school graduation. Professional, respectful, ready for whatever came next. I should have worn armor instead. Have you ever experienced a betrayal so complete it physically hurt? Drop a comment if you felt that knife in your back from family. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had known our family for 30 years. He looked genuinely uncomfortable as he spread the documents across his mahogany desk. My parents sat across from me, hands folded, expressions carefully neutral. This is somewhat unusual, Peterson began, adjusting his glasses. William made several changes to his will over the past 2 years. My stomach dropped. Changes meant complications. Complications meant my parents got their hands dirty. The primary beneficiary of the Morrison estate is Haley Morrison, age 26, currently residing in Boston, Massachusetts. The silence was deafening. I stared at Peterson, certain I'd misheard. My parents' carefully neutral expressions cracked just slightly. I'm sorry, Dad said, his voice strained. Did you say primary beneficiary? The estate totals approximately $4.8 million, Peterson continued, including liquid assets, property holdings, and business investments. Miss Morrison inherits 95% of the estate. Mom's hand flew to her throat. 95%? The remaining 5% is split between Robert Morrison and several designated charities. 5%. After 47 years of being the dutiful son, my father got 5% of his father's estate. That's about $240,000. A nice sum, sure, but not the millions he'd been expecting for decades. There must be some mistake, Dad said, leaning forward. My father always said the estate would be divided among family members. Mr. Morrison was very specific about his intentions, Peterson replied. He felt that Haley demonstrated the responsibility and judgment necessary to honor his legacy. I sat there, numb. $4.8 million. More money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Enough to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. And I'd inherited it from the only person who'd ever really loved me. This is ridiculous, Mom finally exploded. She's just a child. She has no experience managing money. She's 26 with a Harvard law degree, Peterson said mildly. A degree doesn't mean she understands business, Dad added. My father built this wealth over decades. It requires experience, wisdom, both qualities your father felt Haley possessed. The meeting continued for another hour, but I barely heard it. My parents' shock had crystallized into anger, then into determination. I could practically see the gears turning in their heads. Legal challenges, competency hearings, whatever it took to get their hands on Grandpa's money. Of course the will is subject to probate, Peterson mentioned as we prepared to leave. Standard procedure. The court will need to validate the document before assets can be transferred. Bingo. My parents exchanged a look that said they'd found their opening. How long does probate usually take? Mom asked sweetly. 6 months to a year, depending on complications. They were already planning complications. That night, my parents invited me to dinner at the country club. Their treat, they said. Time to talk through everything as a family. I should have seen it coming. We want to challenge the will, Dad said over appetizers. Not out of greed, but out of concern for your welfare. My welfare? Darling, you're 26 years old, Mom said. You've never managed anything bigger than a checking account. This kind of money, it changes people. It attracts the wrong kind of attention. What are you suggesting? A trust, Dad said. With experienced trustees. Mom and myself. We'd manage the estate until you're older, more prepared. I set down my fork carefully. Prepared for what, exactly? To handle this responsibility. Grandpa William meant well, but he wasn't thinking clearly at the end. Actually, Grandpa had been thinking more clearly than ever. He'd seen exactly who my parents were, and he'd protected me accordingly. Even from the grave, he was still taking care of me. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my inheritance. Their faces darkened. The loving, worried parent act vanished like smoke. We'll see about that, Dad said quietly. And that's when I knew the real fight was just beginning. The legal papers arrived by courier 3 weeks later. My parents were contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and beneficiary incapacity. They claimed Grandpa William had been manipulated into changing his will, and that I lacked the experience to manage such a substantial inheritance. Their lawyer was expensive. The kind of expensive that meant they were already spending money they expected to win. This is standard procedure, my own attorney explained during our first meeting. Family disputes over inheritances happen all the time. But the will was clear. Grandpa was mentally competent when he made these decisions. Your parents are arguing otherwise. They've submitted evidence suggesting he was unduly influenced by someone with a financial interest in the outcome. Someone meaning me? Someone meaning you. The irony was suffocating. My parents, who'd lived off Grandpa's generosity for decades while contributing nothing meaningful to his life, were accusing me of manipulation. Me, who'd been too proud to ask him for gas money during college. But here's where things got interesting. During probate proceedings, all estate assets are frozen. That meant my inheritance was locked away in legal limbo, but it also meant my parents couldn't touch it either. Unfortunately, it also meant I couldn't access my own savings account, which had been mysteriously flagged as potentially connected to estate assets. How is my personal account connected to anything? I asked Peterson. Your grandfather made occasional deposits over the years. Gifts, tuition payments. The court wants to ensure there's no commingling of assets. Great. So while my parents continued living in their paid-for house with their paid-for cars, I was suddenly broke. Really broke. Like, eating ramen for dinner broke. That's when my college friend Sarah called with a proposition. She was opening a small cafe near campus and needed help getting it off the ground. Just temporary, she said. A few shifts here and there until she could hire permanent staff. I can't pay much, she warned. Right now, I'd bus tables for free food, I told her. And that's exactly what I did. Sarah's cafe was tiny, maybe 12 tables, specializing in coffee and light meals for students. I worked evening shifts 3 times a week, serving sandwiches and clearing tables. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that paid enough to keep my studio apartment. The job was actually therapeutic. After spending months drowning in legal documents and depositions, there was something satisfying about the simplicity of taking orders and wiping down tables. No complicated family dynamics, No ulterior motives. Just coffee, conversations, and decent tips from college kids. You seem different than most law school graduates, one regular customer mentioned. How so? Less uptight. More real. If only he knew. I'd been working at the cafe for about 6 weeks when it happened. I was refilling the coffee station when I noticed a familiar couple at table 4. Not customers I recognized, but familiar faces from somewhere else. Family friends of my parents. The Hendersons, who'd been at Grandpa's funeral. They were staring at me with expressions of shock and what looked suspiciously like pity. Mrs. Henderson approached the counter when I brought their check. "Haley, dear, is that really you?" "Hi, Mrs. Henderson, how are you?" I'm surprised to see you here." Her eyes took in my cafe apron and the coffee stains on my shirt. "Are you working here?" "Just helping out a friend," I said casually. "Oh, how nice." But her expression said it wasn't nice at all. It said she was already planning the phone call she'd make the moment she got home. 2 days later, my phone rang. Mom's number. "Haley, sweetheart, we need to talk." The ambush came disguised as Sunday dinner. My parents invited me to their house, claiming they wanted to discuss a peaceful resolution to the will contest. What they really wanted was to present their evidence that I was unfit to inherit millions. "We heard you're working as a waitress," Mom said over pot roast that I was pretty sure came from a restaurant. "I'm helping a friend with her cafe. Serving coffee," Dad clarified. "Clearing tables." "Honest work?" "Of course, dear, but it raises questions about your judgment, about your ability to manage significant assets." I set down my fork. "What questions?" "Well," Mom exchanged a look with Dad. "If you had proper business sense, wouldn't you be using this time more productively? Networking, perhaps? Building professional relationships? Instead of taking handouts from your grandfather's estate for decades, you mean?" The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. "We've never taken handouts," Dad said stiffly. "Your grandfather was generous with family. That's different." "Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been living off his money for my entire life." "That's enough," Mom snapped. "This attitude is exactly what we're talking about. This resentment, this hostility toward family. It's not healthy. What's not healthy is 2 grown adults suing their daughter because they can't accept that Daddy finally saw them for who they really are." The mask slipped completely then. No more concerned parents, no more loving family dynamics. Just pure, calculating greed. "You don't deserve that money," Dad said quietly. "You didn't build it. You didn't earn it. You just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And you did earn it? By being a professional disappointment for 47 years? We'll see what the court thinks about your fitness as an heir," Mom said, standing abruptly. "Especially when they see how you're currently living." "You mean honestly? Supporting myself with actual work instead of living off family money? We mean like someone who clearly can't manage her own finances, let alone millions of dollars." They had photos. Mrs. Henderson had been thorough, snapping pictures of me in my cafe apron, looking tired and coffee-stained. Perfect evidence of my financial distress and poor judgment. "The court will see these," Dad said, sliding the printed photos across the table, "along with testimony from character witnesses about your recent decline." I looked at the images. In them, I looked like exactly what I was, a young woman working an honest job to pay her bills. But through my parents' lens, I looked like someone who couldn't handle money, someone who'd squandered opportunities and ended up waiting tables. "You know what?" I said, standing up. "You're absolutely right about one thing. I'm not the daughter you raised." "What's that supposed to mean?" "The daughter you raised would have handed over the money by now. She would have apologized for grandfather loving her more than he loved you. She would have made your greed her problem to solve." I headed toward the door, leaving the photos scattered across their dining room table. "But here's what you don't understand about the granddaughter Grandpa William raised. She doesn't give up, and she definitely doesn't give in to bullies." "We'll see about that," Mom called after me. "Yes," I said over my shoulder. "We will." The court date was set for the following month. My parents were confident they'd proven their case. After all, what judge would trust millions of dollars to a woman who couldn't even afford to stop waitressing during her inheritance dispute? They had no idea what was coming. Have you ever been underestimated so badly it actually worked in your favor? Let me know in the comments because you're about to find out exactly how wrong my parents were about everything. 3 days before the court hearing, my attorney Rebecca gave me advice that would change everything. "Bring a recording device," she said matter-of-factly. "Not to entrap anyone, just to protect yourself. Sometimes judges forget their training when family dynamics get heated." I stared at her. "Is that legal?" "Connecticut is a one-party consent state. You can record any conversation you're part of. And trust me, You want a record of everything that gets said in that courtroom. So there I was, sitting in my car outside the courthouse at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, checking my phone's recording app for the third time. Amazing how technology works, isn't it? 20 years ago, you needed actual equipment to catch people being awful. Now you just need the device everyone carries in their pocket. My parents had arrived 15 minutes earlier in Dad's BMW, the one Grandpa had co-signed for, just until Robert gets back on his feet. That was 8 years ago. Some feet take longer to find their footing, apparently. They'd brought reinforcements. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Jim, even my cousin Marcus, who I hadn't seen since high school. Nothing says we care about family like assembling a courtroom audience to watch you destroy your daughter's future. Rebecca met me at the courthouse steps, looking every inch the competent attorney in her navy suit and sensible heels. How are you feeling? Like I'm about to watch my parents try to steal $4 million while claiming it's for my own good. Are you ready for this? I patted the phone in my jacket pocket. More ready than they think. The courthouse was one of those imposing stone buildings designed to make regular people feel small. Marble floors, oak paneling, portraits of dead judges staring down from the walls. Very intimidating, very official, very much the kind of place where a young woman in a cheap suit might feel overwhelmed. Good thing I wasn't just any young woman. My parents' lawyer was a man named Harrison Blackwell, 60-something with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He had that particular brand of arrogance that comes from decades of winning cases through intimidation rather than actual legal skill. "Miss Morrison?" he said, approaching our table with a condescending smile. "I hope we can keep today's proceedings civil." "Oh, I'm always civil, Mr. Blackwell. Sometimes aggressively so." His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Your parents are hoping to avoid a prolonged legal battle. Perhaps we can reach an amicable settlement." "You mean perhaps I'll roll over and let them take Grandpa's money?" "I mean perhaps we can find a solution that works for everyone." I looked past him to where my parents sat, whispering urgently with their assembled family support system. "Mr. Blackwell, the solution that works for everyone is the one Grandpa William already chose. It's called his will. We'll see what the court thinks about that." Oh, we definitely would. At 9:30 sharp, the bailiff called our case. Morrison versus Morrison, probate matter 2024 PR 1847. Here we go, I thought. Discreetly starting the recording app as I stood. Time to find out exactly how low my parents were willing to go. Spoiler alert, lower than I imagined. Judge Harold Pemberton looked exactly like central casting would order for intimidating authority figure. 60s graybeard, the kind of deep voice that made lawyers nervous. He'd been on the bench for 22 years, which meant he'd seen every family dispute imaginable, or so he thought. "This is a contested probate matter," he began, adjusting his reading glasses. "The plaintiffs, Robert and Linda Morrison, are challenging the will of William Morrison on grounds of undue influence and beneficiary incapacity." Beneficiary incapacity. That's legal speak for too stupid to handle money. Charming, right? Blackwell stood to present their case, spreading photographs across the evidence table like he was revealing state secrets. "Your Honor, these images show the current lifestyle of the proposed beneficiary. As you can see, Miss Morrison has been working in food service, specifically as a waitress, during the probate period. The photos were actually pretty good quality. Mrs. Henderson had missed her calling as a surveillance photographer. There I was, looking tired and coffee-stained, clearly struggling to make ends meet. The plaintiffs contend," Blackwell continued, "that this demonstrates a fundamental lack of financial responsibility. Someone capable of managing a $4.8 million inheritance would not find themselves in such circumstances." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The logic was spectacular. Because I was too proud to live off family money while fighting for my inheritance, I was therefore too irresponsible to deserve the inheritance. It's like saying someone can't swim because they refuse to jump into a pool while wearing concrete boots. Furthermore, Blackwell added, Miss Morrison has no experience in business management, investment strategy, or estate planning. She's a recent graduate with minimal real-world experience. My parents nodded along solemnly, playing their roles perfectly. Concerned family members, reluctantly forced to protect a beloved daughter from her own poor judgment. The plaintiffs propose a managed trust structure, Blackwell concluded, with experienced trustees overseeing the assets until Miss Morrison demonstrates the maturity necessary for such responsibility. Experienced trustees being my parents, naturally. The same experienced trustees who'd never held a real job between them. Judge Pemberton examined the photographs with interest. "These images show Miss Morrison in what appears to be a service position?" "Yes, Your Honor. Waiting tables at a local cafe." "And this was during the probate period, when estate assets were frozen?" "Correct." The judge frowned thoughtfully. So Miss Morrison was supporting herself through honest employment rather than what? What would the alternative have been? Blackwell hesitated slightly. Well, someone with proper financial planning would have resources. Resources from where exactly? The estate was frozen pending this hearing. I watched Blackwell realize he'd painted his clients into a corner. If I'd had independent wealth, it would undermine their argument that I needed Grandpa's money. If I didn't have independent wealth, then working to support myself was exactly what any responsible person would do. The point, Your Honor, is that Miss Morrison's choices reflect a pattern of poor judgment. Working to pay rent reflects poor judgment. Working in food service when one has a law degree suggests limited ambition. And there it was. The class prejudice that had been simmering under the surface finally broke through. In Blackwell's world, certain jobs were beneath certain people. Manual labor was evidence of moral failing rather than honest work ethic. I felt my phone recording every word, capturing the casual elitism that would sound very different when played back later. Judge Pemberton's expression was unreadable. I see. And what did the plaintiffs propose as evidence of their own fitness to manage these assets? Decades of life experience, Your Honor. Mature judgment. Robert Morrison has been involved in various business ventures. Successful business ventures? Another hesitation. Business involves risk, Your Honor. Sometimes ventures don't fulfill their initial promise. Meaning they failed? Meaning they provided valuable learning experiences. If mental gymnastics were an Olympic sport, Blackwell would have just earned a gold medal. 47 years of financial failure had become valuable learning experiences. This was getting good. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments because this is where everything changed. Judge Pemberton leaned back in his chair, studying the evidence before him. The photographs, the financial records, the character testimonials my parents had assembled. Everything designed to paint me as an incompetent child who'd stumbled into wealth she couldn't handle. Miss Morrison, he said, you've been notably quiet during these proceedings. I stood slowly. I was listening, Your Honor. And what's your response to these allegations about your fitness as a beneficiary? Here's where a normal person might have gotten defensive, might have argued about the unfairness of judging someone by their temporary circumstances, might have pointed out the obvious hypocrisy of my parents' position. But I'm not normal people. I'm Grandpa William's granddaughter, and he raised me better than that. Your Honor, I said calmly, I'd like to address the court about my qualifications. Please proceed. I glanced at my parents, who were leaning forward with barely concealed anticipation. They thought this was my moment to crumble under pressure, to prove their point about my immaturity and poor judgment. The plaintiffs have presented evidence that I work as a server at a local cafe, I began. This is accurate. During the probate period, when my personal accounts were frozen due to their connection to estate assets, I took honest employment to support myself. Judge Pemberton nodded. Reasonable response to difficult circumstances. Thank you, Your Honor. The plaintiffs have also argued that I lack the experience and education necessary to manage significant assets. And your response? I took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything Grandpa William had invested in me, every lesson he'd taught about dignity and perseverance, came down to this. Your Honor, my parents seem to believe that working as a server disqualifies me from managing money. I paused, looking directly at them. But they failed to mention what I do when I'm not serving coffee. My mother's brow furrowed slightly. Something in my tone was registering as different from what she'd expected. I'm curious to hear more, Judge Pemberton said. And that's when I delivered the line that would haunt my parents for the rest of their lives. Your Honor, while my parents were collecting evidence of my supposedly poor judgment, they forgot to ask what qualified me for that judgment in the first place. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a leather portfolio. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. I spent 3 years with Morrison, Phillips & Associates specializing in estate planning and probate law. I'm currently waiting tables not because I can't do anything else, but because I refuse to compromise my integrity while fighting for what my grandfather left me. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Furthermore, I continued, my parents claim I'm unfit to manage $4.8 million, but they themselves have never successfully managed anything except to live off my grandfather's generosity for decades. Judge Pemberton's expression shifted from mild interest to sharp attention. But here's what really demonstrates my fitness as a beneficiary, I said, my voice steady and clear. I knew this hearing would reveal exactly who my parents are, so I took the precaution of recording every word that's been said here today. I pulled out my phone, the recording app still running, including Your Honor's comment about a waitress handling millions being quite brilliant. Judge Pemberton went pale. Not just pale. The color drained from his face like someone had opened a tap. Wait, he stammered. I never... I didn't say. Actually, Your Honor, you did. Along with several other observations that I believe the Judicial Review Board might find interesting. The courtroom erupted in chaos. My parents were staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an alien. Blackwell looked like he'd swallowed his briefcase. And Judge Pemberton? Well, Judge Pemberton looked like a man who'd just realized his career might be over. Have you ever seen someone's entire worldview collapse in real time? It's quite something to witness. Judge Pemberton was frantically flipping through his notes, apparently trying to figure out how this had gone so wrong so fast. My parents were having an urgent whispered conference with Blackwell, who kept shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a bad dream. Your Honor, Rebecca stood smoothly. Given the irregular nature of these proceedings, I move for an immediate recess while we determine the appropriate next steps. Recess granted, Pemberton said quickly. 1 hour. As soon as he'd fled the bench, my parents surrounded me like angry bees. What the hell do you think you're doing? Dad hissed. Protecting myself from judicial bias, I replied calmly. Though I have to say, I'm impressed by how thoroughly you researched my employment history, while completely ignoring my educational background. You let us think you were just a waitress, Mom accused. Actually, I never told you anything. You assumed, which is different from lying, though I realize the distinction might be too subtle for people who've spent decades living off someone else's money. This is entrapment, Blackwell interjected. No, Mr. Blackwell, this is documentation. Connecticut is a one-party consent state, as I'm sure you know. Everything recorded here is perfectly legal. The beautiful thing about shocking revelations is watching people's priorities realign in real time. Suddenly, my parents weren't concerned about my fitness as an heir. Now they were worried about explaining to their social circle why their daughter had just publicly humiliated them. You can't use that recording, Dad said desperately. Actually, I can, and I will. See, Grandpa William taught me something important. When people show you who they are, believe them. Today, all of you showed me exactly who you are. Haley, please, Mom pleaded. We're family. Family doesn't try to steal from each other. Mother, family doesn't pay investigators to follow each other around. And family definitely doesn't laugh while a biased judge mocks their daughter in open court. Because yes, they had laughed, all of them. When Judge Pemberton made his little joke about waitresses managing millions, my parents and their assembled supporters had laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. The recording captured every chuckle. What do you want? Blackwell asked, cutting to the heart of it. I want exactly what Grandpa William wanted, for his will to be honored, and for his granddaughter to inherit what he chose to leave her. And the recording? The recording goes wherever it needs to go. Judicial Review Board, State Bar Association, local news if they're interested. Depends on how this proceeding concludes. Over the next hour, several interesting things happened. Rebecca filed a motion for judicial recusal based on demonstrated bias. The court clerk began making urgent phone calls about irregularities in the proceeding. And my parents finally understood that their daughter wasn't the naive child they'd been manipulating for decades. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Pemberton looked like he'd aged 5 years. After careful consideration, he began, his voice notably less confident than before, this court recognizes that certain comments may have created an appearance of bias in these proceedings. An appearance of bias. Like calling someone unfit for inheritance based on their temporary employment was just a tiny procedural hiccup. Therefore, I'm recusing myself from this matter. The case will be transferred to another judge for fresh consideration. My parents looked sick. Blackwell looked like he wanted to disappear. And I looked like exactly what I was. Grandpa William's granddaughter, who'd learned from the best how to handle bullies with grace and devastating effectiveness. Your Honor, Rebecca said, given the circumstances, we'll also be filing complaints with the appropriate oversight bodies regarding today's proceedings. That's your right, of course. As we filed out of the courtroom, I caught my parents staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to fear. They'd just realized they'd been playing chess with someone they thought was playing checkers. Game over. Game. 3 days later, the recording was everywhere. Not because I leaked it. I'm not that vindictive. But apparently, someone in the court clerk's office found Judge Pemberton's behavior so appalling that they made sure the local legal community heard about it. Amazing how fast news travels in small legal circles. Judge under investigation for courtroom bias ran as the headline in the Connecticut Law Tribune. The recording played on local news stations, with my voice carefully edited out to protect privacy, but Judge Pemberton's commentary preserved in all its prejudiced glory. A waitress handling millions? Quite brilliant! Became an instant meme in legal Twitter circles. Nothing quite like becoming a cautionary tale about judicial ethics, I imagine. My phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting statements, lawyers offering representation, distant relatives suddenly remembering they cared about my well-being. I ignored most of them, but one call was worth taking. Miss Morrison? This is David Chen from the State Judicial Review Board. Mr. Chen, we've received your formal complaint regarding Judge Pemberton's conduct. I wanted to personally assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously. I appreciate that. The recording you provided demonstrates clear judicial bias and inappropriate commentary. Judge Pemberton has been temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. Temporarily suspended. In judicial terms, that was basically a death sentence for his career. Judges who get investigated for bias don't typically bounce back from the experience. What happens next with my case? It's been reassigned to Judge Maria Santos. She's one of our most respected probate judges. 30 years on the bench, impeccable record. Your hearing is scheduled for next Monday. Monday. After months of legal limbo, everything would finally be resolved in 4 days. Mr. Chen? One more thing. Will this affect how Judge Pemberton's other cases are reviewed? We're conducting a comprehensive audit of his recent decisions. If we find patterns of bias or inappropriate conduct, affected parties will have grounds for appeal. So my little recording session might help other people who'd been subjected to Judge Pemberton's particular brand of justice. Grandpa William would have approved of that collateral benefit. The weekend passed slowly. My parents didn't call, didn't text, didn't attempt any contact. According to Rebecca, Blackwell had withdrawn from representing them, citing irreconcilable differences in legal strategy. Translation, he didn't want his name associated with their impending humiliation. They'd hired a new lawyer, someone cheaper and less experienced. Someone willing to continue a case that everyone now knew was doomed. Sunday evening, I sat in my small apartment reviewing everything that had led to this moment. The little girl who'd been shuffled off to Grandpa's house because she was inconvenient. The teenager who'd watched her parents take credit for her achievements. The college graduate who'd been excluded from family celebrations because she might overshadow her relatives. All of it had been preparing me for this week. For the moment when I'd finally stop accommodating other people's selfishness and start demanding the respect Grandpa William had always said I deserved. Monday morning, I dressed carefully in the navy suit I'd worn to Grandpa's funeral. Professional, respectful, but with a subtle authority that hadn't been there before. 6 months of legal battles had changed me, refined me, turned me into someone who wouldn't be dismissed or underestimated. Judge Maria Santos was everything Judge Pemberton wasn't. Professional, courteous, focused on law rather than personal prejudices. She reviewed the case files with careful attention, asked relevant questions, and treated everyone in her courtroom with equal respect. This is a straightforward probate matter, she began. The deceased clearly expressed his intentions in a legally valid will. The burden is on the plaintiffs to demonstrate compelling reasons why those intentions should not be honored. My parents' new lawyer, a nervous man named Patterson, presented essentially the same arguments Blackwell had made. But without the prejudicial commentary from the bench, his case sounded exactly like what it was. Entitled family members upset about being excluded from an inheritance they'd never earned. Miss Morrison, Judge Santos said when it was my turn, do you have anything to add? Only this, Your Honor. My grandfather was a man who valued integrity, hard work, and personal responsibility. He chose to leave his estate to me not because I was family, but because I demonstrated the qualities he respected. I intend to honor that trust. Judge Santos nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Patterson, does your client have any evidence of actual incapacity or undue influence beyond speculation about the beneficiary's temporary employment status? Patterson shuffled his papers helplessly. The employment demonstrates someone supporting herself honestly during a difficult period. Unless you have evidence of fraud, coercion, or mental incapacity, this court sees no grounds to overturn a clear and legally executed will. And just like that, it was over. In the matter of Morrison versus Morrison, this court finds no compelling evidence to invalidate the will of William Morrison. The estate shall be distributed according to the deceased's clearly expressed intentions, with Haley Morrison as primary beneficiary. Judge Santos's gavel came down with a crisp finality that echoed through the courtroom. My parents sat frozen in their seats, finally comprehending that their months of legal maneuvering had accomplished nothing except exposing their own character. Furthermore, Judge Santos continued, given the frivolous nature of this challenge and its impact on estate resources, the plaintiffs are ordered to pay all court costs and legal fees associated with these proceedings. That was the cherry on top. Not only had my parents lost their bid for Grandpa's money, but they'd now have to pay for the privilege of having their greed displayed in open court. Justice has a wonderful sense of humor sometimes. As people filed out of the courtroom, I remained seated for a moment, absorbing the reality. $4.8 million. Enough money to do whatever I wanted. wherever I wanted, for the rest of my life. But more importantly, vindication. Proof that Grandpa William's faith in me had been justified. Congratulations, Rebecca said, gathering her files. Though I have to say, I've never seen a case resolve quite like this one. What happens now? Now we wait for the estate to clear probate, which should be routine since there's no longer any dispute. You'll have access to your inheritance within 30 days. My parents approached our table slowly, looking like mourners at their own funeral. Dad's face was gray, Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, and they both carried themselves like people who'd just realized they'd destroyed something irreplaceable. Haley, Mom began, we need to talk. No, you really don't. Please, we're still family. Are we? Because family doesn't typically hire lawyers to prove each other incompetent. Dad stepped forward. We made mistakes. We weren't thinking clearly. You were thinking very clearly. You were thinking about $4.8 million and how to get your hands on it. We were worried about you, Mom insisted. You were worried about yourselves. There's a difference. They stood there for a long moment, apparently waiting for me to absolve them of their behavior, to make their guilt my responsibility to manage, the way I'd been managing their problems my entire life. But Grandpa William's granddaughter doesn't do that anymore. I hope this was worth it, I said finally. The legal fees, the public humiliation, the complete destruction of whatever relationship we had left. I hope proving that I'm unfit to inherit money was worth losing your daughter. You're being dramatic, Dad said weakly. Am I? You tried to steal my inheritance. You laughed when a judge mocked me in court. You hired investigators to photograph me at work like I was some kind of criminal. What exactly was dramatic about my response? They had no answer for that. No clever rationalization that could transform their greed into concern, their betrayal into love. The estate will be settled within 30 days, I told them. After that, I'll be making some changes to my life. New city, new opportunities. I suggest you do the same. As I walked out of the courthouse, my phone buzzed with text messages. Sarah from the cafe, congratulating me on my victory. Former classmates who'd seen the news coverage. Even a few job offers from law firms impressed by my handling of the case. But the message that mattered most was waiting at home. A sealed envelope with Grandpa William's handwriting, to be opened after the will is settled. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief note. Haley, if you're reading this, it means you stood up for yourself and won. I always knew you would. The money is yours to do with as you choose, but remember what I taught you. Wealth is a tool, not a goal. Use it wisely, help others when you can, and never let anyone make you feel small. You're stronger than you know. Love, Grandpa. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my new office in Boston, where I've joined a firm specializing in elder law and estate planning. Turns out there are a lot of families out there struggling with the same dynamics that nearly destroyed mine. My inheritance? I've invested most of it responsibly, the way Grandpa would have wanted. But I've also used part of it to fund a legal clinic that helps people navigate family disputes and inheritance challenges. Free representation for those who can't afford to fight for what's rightfully theirs. My parents and I don't speak anymore. Not because I'm holding grudges, but because some relationships can't survive certain betrayals. They chose money over family, and that choice came with permanent consequences. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes the people who try to tear you down actually do you a favor. My parents' greed forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I had. Their betrayal taught me the difference between blood relatives and real family. Their attempt to humiliate me ended up proving exactly why Grandpa William chose me as his heir. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more tales about family drama, legal victories, and the importance of standing up for yourself. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply living well enough that your enemy's opinions become completely irrelevant. Trust me, it's worth the wait.